We're delighted to have with us this afternoon Mary Louise Kelly. Mary Louise is a first-time novelist, but she's very experienced as a journalist, a field she entered about 20 years ago, landing her first paying job covering local politics for her hometown newspaper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Soon after, she moved into broadcasting, working with the BBC as a host, foreign correspondent, and producer, and with CNN as a producer. Then she joined NPR, and over the past decade, she's covered intelligence and defense issues for them. She currently serves as a guest host for Morning Edition and All Things Considered, and also teaches journalism and national security at Georgetown University. Her journalism career has taken Mary Louise to a lot of places, from the Afghan-Pakistan border to the deck of a nuclear aircraft carrier, from Northern Ireland to Cambodia. And now her new novel, Anonymous Sources, has taken her into the world of fiction writing. Lest you think she was a natural at it, Mary Louise herself readily admits that she knew nothing about fiction writing when she began. In the acknowledgments of her book, she recalls that her agent, after viewing an early draft of Anonymous Sources, commented, "This is pretty bad. Actually, it's awful." But she got better, much better, with successive drafts, situating the book in places she knows well, and constructing the plot around what are, for her, very familiar characters: journalists, spies, and terrorists. In fact, the protagonist in Anonymous Sources is an attractive, resourceful female journalist who bears some resemblance to Mary Louise, inasmuch as she goes after a big national security story and has a weakness for impractical Italian shoes. But in other ways, as Mary Louise herself has pointed out, this lead character is nothing like Mary Louise. For instance, she has flaming red hair, and she shoots dead one of her sources. And for the record, Mary Louise would like everyone to know that she has never murdered any of her sources. Yet, right? Anyway, all in all, Anonymous Sources is a fast-paced thriller with lots of plot twists and cliffhangers. As one reviewer wrote, quote, "This story has a bit of everything: espionage, murder, travel, and high heels. There is sex, violence, and booze." In other words, it's a perfect summer read. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mary Louise Kelly.
It did get better after my agent saw the first draft, I promise. Thank you for that, Bradley. And I will just make one further pitch. Those of you who are regulars at Politics and Prose, as my family are, we're here just about every Saturday after Stoddart soccer games or in between multiple Stoddart soccer games. You will know what an amazing job they do supporting both experienced and rookie writers. You know what a huge role this store plays in the intellectual and literary life of our city, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here since y'all are all here, but I would second the pitch to sign up, be members, enjoy the talk, buy lots of books while you're here. Now, I woke up this morning, as many of you may have, to the news that Edward Snowden, the ex-NSA contractor, had fled Hong Kong, hopped a plane to Moscow, was en route. I mean, it was changing minute by minute. At one point, he was going to head to Havana and then on to Venezuela. The latest is he has apparently applied for asylum in Ecuador. And I had two thoughts when I woke up and heard this. The first was, had I tried, I could not have come up with a more perfect storm of news events into which to launch a novel titled Anonymous Thrillers. So thank you, news gods. The other thought I had was, thank goodness I'm not still on the intelligence beat, because I would have been summoned out of bed at some ungodly hour. The phone call would have come in and said, "We need you to come work this story." And who knows whether I would have made it here this afternoon to get to speak to all of you. Because as Bradley said, this was my job for many years. For first at the Journal-Constitution in Atlanta, and then the BBC, a brief detour via CNN, and then landed here 12 years ago and started working at NPR. I launched the intelligence beat for NPR in 2004. And what does that mean? I didn't know when I started. It meant I was supposed to be reporting on the NSA, the National Security Agency, the CIA, the other members of the U.S. intelligence community, the intelligence committees on the Hill, the House and Senate intelligence committees, trying to work sources at the White House on the National Security Council. And then in 2009, right after President Obama took office for the first time, I took on the Pentagon beat, which meant obviously that I was covering the Pentagon here in Washington, covering defense issues, but also traveling a lot. When the defense secretary travels, there's almost always a press pool that travels with him. In my case, that was when Secretary Gates was serving in that role. And so just about every time he got on a plane and went overseas, I was part of that press pool on the plane with him, reporting on who he was meeting and where he went and what they were talking about. And it was on one of those trips that I had the first of what I would call the two light bulb moments that led to writing the book. This particular trip, I was in the Middle East. We had started in Jerusalem and then traveled on to Amman for meetings, then had a stop at a military air base in the southern part of the country near Nasiriyah, and then finally arrived in Baghdad. And a sandstorm was blowing in. And it was not safe to put the defense secretary in a convoy of cars and drive across the city, so a swarm of Black Hawk helicopters was summoned to whisk us from the airstrip and onto the meetings that were scheduled at the Iraqi Defense Ministry. And so we're strapping in for takeoff, and my cell phone rang, or vibrated. And, you're in full body armor to move around in Baghdad, so I had to kind of hike up my flak jacket and push back my helmet and answer, and I hear this voice sounding very far away saying, "Hello, Mrs. Kelly." It's hard to hear over half a dozen helicopters, so I had to ask her to speak up, and it took me a minute to realize the caller was the nurse at my son's school here in Washington, calling to say that my 4-year-old was sick. She was saying, I need to ask you to come get him. And, any parent who's gotten a phone call, it doesn't matter where you are, your heart kind of skips a beat. And I said, oh no, what is it? I cannot come get him. I'm traveling, I'm overseas, And she interrupted and said, no, I don't mean to bring him home. I mean, he is really sick. He's barely breathing. We need to get him to a doctor right now, or maybe to the hospital. And my heart stopped. And I was trying to answer her when the line died. Phone lost the connection. And the helicopter lifted up, and my son needed me, and I was in a helicopter halfway around the world, staring down over the snarled traffic of Baghdad. And it felt suddenly, blindingly obvious that it was time for career Plan B. But I didn't know what that would be. I'd been a journalist for 20 years. I didn't know what that might look like. Took me a little while to figure it out. Light bulb moment number 2. Much less dramatic. I was in the shower here in Washington. Shortly after the Baghdad trip, I'm racing to get ready for work, get out the door, get to the office in the morning. And I was, of course, listening to NPR on the shower radio. And Morning Edition that morning was running a Crime in the City interview. Are you all familiar with this series? This is where it's about fictional detectives in the cities in which they live. And so Joe Nesbo will come on and talk about Oslo, or Karen Slaughter will come on and talk about Atlanta. David Baldacci has done one here in Washington. On this particular morning, it was Kara Black who was being interviewed. Kara Black, as some of you may know, writes murder mysteries set in Paris. So I'm shampooing, listening to her talk, and she was talking about her work routine, and she spends a couple months a year in Paris doing research, and then she writes a book, and then she goes on book tour, and then she takes some time off to be with her family, and I'm sitting there listening to this, and I leaned over and tapped on the glass wall of the shower and called for my husband, who's shaving, trying to get ready for work himself across the room, and I said, "Are you listening to this? She's having so much more fun than we are. Why aren't we writing murder mysteries set in Paris?" And I'll never forget, he looked up and he said, "Yeah, why not?" And I thought, yeah, why not? So I haven't managed, this is not set in Paris, sadly, working on that one, but I did start thinking about it. I had dabbled with maybe trying to write fiction, but I decided to give it a shot. And I asked NPR for a 4-day work week. And on Fridays, I would walk down to my neighborhood Barnes & Noble. Sorry, they're closer. And I would become one of those annoying people who orders one latte and nurses it for 9 hours and hogs the table. And I did not get up until I finished a chapter every Friday. Well, you start writing a book, you have decisions to make, right? I mean, among the big ones are, who's your main character going to be? Who are the players? Who's the cast in this novel? And what's the story going to be? What's the plot? So my protagonist is a reporter. Her name is Alexandra James. I should tell you, I named her Alexandra James after my sons, Alexander and James, so that every time I sat down at my laptop and every time I cursed the 4 a.m. alarm that was going to get me up 2 hours before work so that I could squeeze in some writing, I would remember Alexandra James. This is why I'm doing it. So she is a reporter. She is not me, it's true. She writes for a newspaper, a fictional newspaper called the New England Chronicle. She is a total handful, which made her a lot of fun to write. She does have bright red hair. She also has great shoes. As you mentioned, she has much better legs than I do. I'm working on that. She has a true talent for getting into mischief, which made her a lot of fun to write. And she chases a big national security story from Harvard Yard to Cambridge, England, to here in Washington, D.C. So I'd come up with a heroine, and then I was thinking, all right, well, what is the story going to be? How should this unfold? And for the plot, I really did depend on my day job, my experience as a reporter. I decided to subscribe to the go big or go home school of thriller writing, meaning if my heroine's going to be up against a challenge, let's make it the worst possible thing you can imagine. So what is that? And I thought about all the years that I had spent interviewing officials at the White House or the Pentagon or the State Department for work. And when you really sat down and talked to them and said, what is the worst national security threat we're facing? What keeps you awake at night? The answer that most of them gave back was the nightmare scenario of a terrorist somehow getting his hands on a nuclear weapon. They also told me that when you map weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, that all roads intersect in Pakistan. And I gave one of my characters the line, Pakistan has more terrorists per square mile than any place on Earth, and it has a nuclear weapons program growing faster than any place on Earth. What could possibly go wrong? This was a situation that the Obama administration has actually grappled with and that I have reported on. There was a serious scare just a few months into President Obama's first term where the NSA, the National Security Agency, was picking up chatter that the Tehrik-i Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, had obtained nuclear materials, perhaps even a functioning nuclear device. And the CIA sent briefers to the Oval Office and briefed President Obama on this. There's actually a fascinating account of that conversation if you're interested in David Sanger's new book, the New York Times reporter, David Sanger's new book. So after that briefing, as you can imagine, frantic efforts kicked in to try to figure out, is there something to all this chatter? Is anything missing from Pakistan's facilities? And this is a tricky business because anytime questions are raised about Pakistan's nuclear security, they insist that the nuclear facilities are foolproof. As I say, I've reported a lot on this both here in Washington and in Pakistan. I've gone out to interview General Kidwai, who was head of the SPD, the Pakistan's national nuclear security establishment. And I know you fly into the airport in Islamabad and you get in a car and drive down this rutted road out to the military garrison in Rawalpindi, where his office is. And we sat and sipped tea. He's got this big overstuffed white leather sofa, and he showed me around his collection of, he's got an amazing collection of models of miniature Pakistani missiles that are all over the office. And we sat there and he told me that Pakistan's nuclear security is perfect. And let's hope that he is right. There have been a lot of steps taken to ensure that that is the case. They have gone through and tried to ensure that the components are stored separately. So if you have a warhead, you want to make sure that the missile and the detonator are not kept in the same place. They have strengthened the background checks for workers at nuclear facilities. They've done simple things like just try to build stronger fences around the sites so that you can't smash a car through. But as any of you who follow the news may know, Pakistan's recent history does not exactly suggest that we should have complete confidence. There have been numerous attacks over the last several years on military installations in the country, from Peshawar in the north to Karachi in the south to Lahore to Rawalpindi, the very headquarters of Pakistan's army. And I bet you, had you asked Pakistani officials the day before any of those attacks occurred, they would have assured you that the security at those facilities was foolproof and perfect too. So that is the crisis that I set up in the novel. Hello.
So I have had a chance to read this. I loved it. But it scared me. It really scared me. And I think part of what scared me was how very plausible it is, and how that plausibility came from your knowledge of the details and the way you infuse those details in here. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how scared are you to live in DC knowing what you know?
And I should mention before she sits down, many of you may have read, this is Alison Leota, who writes great legal thrillers set here in DC and has her third coming out in August. So when you finish reading and rereading this all June, you can then move on to Alison's book. You know, it is funny. I think that every year since 9/11 that something like this does not happen is great news. I guess up until this spring, when we had the Boston Marathon bombings, the threat of terrorism felt as though it were receding. I mean, I know from a news organization point of view, some news organizations that had launched terrorism or intelligence beats in the years after 9/11 are not filling those positions when they empty, or reassigning reporters. And I mention that just as an illustration of how in the national consciousness there are other many problems, and terrorism today does not seem to be as quite a hideous threat as it was 10 years ago. But then something like Boston happens, obviously not on the scale of 9/11, obviously not on the scale of a nuclear terrorist attack, thank goodness. But remind you, there are people out there who are very angry, and also remind you that the number of nuclear weapons in the world is growing. And as more countries that have not chosen to sign on to all of the international treaties governing them and allowing inspections develop them, there is cause for concern. For years, that concern focused primarily on former Soviet Union states. Now there's increasing concern about Pakistan. It's, to directly answer your question, my husband and I have actually talked about that. When I would come home from reporting certain stories and I would say, what are we doing? When officials say it's not a matter of if but when, and you know that if terrorists got one, they're not going to waste it on a city, on any old city. They're going to choose Washington, New York, London. Why are we living here with two little kids? And I remember saying to my husband, we should just move to the South Pacific or something. And that weekend, a tsunami hit in the South Pacific and wiped out, one of the islands that we were chatting about. So I think we finally said, you You can spend your life worrying about something, or you can accept the risks for what they are and live with it. No, one of the NPR journalists.
As an accomplished journalist who had to write every day, often on deadlines imposed to you by those horrible people at NPR, what was different and harder about writing fiction? Because I'm sure there's a lot of people in this room even who have sort of fantasized about this notion of just going off and writing something, and they probably think, oh, well, for journalists to go off and write something, it's probably easier for them than for most people. But I have a suspicion that's not exactly the case.
I missed deadlines writing this. I would have loved, when you're writing a debut novel, it's not like the world is waiting for this. I know it wasn't like any publisher was breathing down my neck saying, please, we can't wait for anonymous sources. So, there's nobody pushing you but you to get this done. And I so wished those days when I was on deadline for All Things Considered, and where for better or worse, whatever you had at 4:00 in the afternoon, you went to air with it. You gave it your best shot. And then the next day was a clean slate. And writing a novel, particularly one where you're not on any kind of deadline, is of course not like that. And you can, torment yourself and spend an entire day trying to write the perfect sentence or the perfect comeback for your character to have. And it was a process for me figuring out how to organize my time and actually get this done. One of the best pieces of advice I got was from another writer who said, there will be days when you are typing, and even as you're writing, it's just awful. It's just complete, zilch. It's like the worst thing you've ever written, but write it anyway. You can always go back and edit. Sometimes it's only by writing the truly horrendous version, the really just cheesy, treacly, I'm cringing even as I type version, that the way you want to write it becomes clear to you. You realize the reason this isn't working is because she wouldn't be sad, she would be mad. And then once you get that, once you've wasted 2 days writing it one way, then it becomes clear to you how you wanted to write it. And I had to get pretty disciplined about just saying one way or the other, I'm going to show up and sit down on my laptop and not stand up until I've written 3 pages, or whatever it is for you, whatever your pace is. So that was tough. On the other hand, being a journalist was very helpful. Writing for broadcast, when you write for NPR, you are trying to write conversationally. You're not trying to deliver a sermon. And the people who do it well write and sound as though they're just talking to you on the air. That's really useful when you're trying to write dialogue, because we talk in sentence fragments and use slang and, kind of digress until you make your point. And you don't want to do that too much to test the reader's patience, but to a certain extent, that's the way people talk. And that was useful to have had some experience in that. The other thing I thought was useful was just that concept, again, a good broadcast piece, you try to hook the reader at the beginning and then kind of parcel out what you're telling them, just enough to keep them interested in the story, but so that they'll listen through to the end. They want to know, well, how's it going to end? How's it going to end? That's obviously a different skill doing that on a daily deadline, 4-minute piece for morning edition, than for a 350-page book. But it was kind of fun. That was a fun challenge to figure out, how that one skill set I could weasel it into writing a very different type of literature. So that was fun.
When Alexander and James get older, might you return to journalism? And if you do, what will you bring from what you've learned about writing fiction?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because I've been asked how going one direction to the other. I was saying to Bradley before we started, I resigned my NPR staff job 3 years ago because it became clear to me that trying to cover the Pentagon beat full-time and write a book and have 2 little kids was not working for anyone. And something had to go, and the kids weren't going to go. And I thought, well, I'll try this and see what happens. And I was fortunate enough to get asked to come back and do a lot of hosting, anchoring at NPR, which kind of slated the urge to be in the newsroom for a while, or slaked that urge for a little while. But I still miss it all the time. When I wake up this morning, I feel really conflicted emotions. On the one hand, kind of glad that I'm not getting the 5 a.m. call to rush in on a Sunday morning. On the other hand, it's strange, having spent 20 years in the daily news business. It's really weird to sit through a big news story on what would have been my beat, or to sit through an election and not be able to engage in it in the way that I am used to engaging. So I'm kind of waiting to see how this summer goes, to be honest. I mean, knock on wood, the book will do well, and I'll write another one. On the other hand, I do still miss being in the newsroom all the time. I would love to find a way to keep being able to do some combination of the two. And in terms of what I'll bring back, I guess, it's tough when you're constantly on deadline and for the newscast, trying to file a complete story in 45 seconds or less. But I've learned a lot about writing from writing fiction, a lot about how you keep somebody's interest, about how you, I guess the best way to put it is, I always have found that the best news stories are the ones that bring some personal element, even to the big policy stories, find some way of making it relevant, of answering the why should I care question for the average reader or listener who's not going to be immediately impacted by the latest arms deal to Syria or whatever it is. And developing characters, having the freedom to make up a character out of thin air and figure out what would make me interested enough in this character to want to find out what happens to her, to want to root one way or the other for her. That's been an interesting lesson, and I think I would take that back to the newsroom as well.
So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the process, more about that. One, how much time elapsed between the time you started writing just on Fridays or in the mornings and when you actually quit the job and started working on this full time? And then how much time did it take after that? And how much additional research did you feel you had to do for a fictionalized for a novel like this, versus just making it up?
Right. So 2 questions: how long does it take to write, and then how much research do you do for it? The how long does it take to write, I still wish I could figure that out, because I'm trying to write a second one now and keep trying to figure out if I'm, working at a reasonable pace or not. And my experience, everybody's is different. I was working full time when I tried to start writing this, and I actually was fairly productive, but one day a week, it takes you a couple hours to kind of get back in the mood, and it's you have to kickstart yourself every week. Once I really got on a roll, I think I got a decent draft of this done in about 6 months. And I've talked to other, again, this is a beach read. It's a thriller. This is not Tolstoy. This is not something that should take you 10 years to write. But I've talked to people, you see some of the prominent thriller writers who write 2 books a year. And I think, how on earth do you do that and promote it and have a life? And others who take 5 years, 10 years, who knows? I don't know if there's a right amount of time for it. For me, writing 3 single-spaced, typical-looking Microsoft Word pages a day was like a good target. And I managed to hit that if I focused on it for 6 or 8 hours. And, if I got that done most days, then that's about how long it took me to produce this. And then there's the whole story of trying to sell it and editing it, and that's a whole nother sphere. In terms of the research I did for this, there are obviously aspects of this that track my life. It's not autobiographical in any way, but I knew if a scene was unfolding in the newsroom and an editor was hassling the reporter to go back and get more information, I knew how those conversations would unfold because I've had them on both sides for a while. I would not attempt to write a medical thriller, say, because I think it's like the little details that make it authentic, and I don't know what exactly the ER nurse would say to the ER doctor in a certain case, but I do know how these conversations in the newsroom unfold, or between a reporter and their source. But I did go back and do quite a lot of information, and that's fun. I mean, there's the adage, write what you know. There's also the write what you want to learn about. And I, went back even places that I thought I knew pretty well already. I went back and visited before I wrote them. That scene that I read, where Tom Carlyle climbs the bell tower and tries to open the window and, has to kick at the bottom pane. That I'd been up in that bell tower before. Eliot House was my dorm when I was an undergrad at Harvard. And so I'd written the scene before I could get access to go up there. And when I went up there, I looked around and said, oh, shoot. The window that I had him falling out of is nailed shut and looks like it has been since about 1939. He couldn't possibly have fallen out that window. And it impacted the scene of what he was looking at. And was he looking toward the law school or the business school? Could he see the river or not? And I thought, I was up there by myself, and I thought, who's going to know if the window opens? Like, you could just fall out the window. It could happen. And I think that was the reporter in me. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't say that he opened the window on the right if that window doesn't open. So he falls out the window on the left. I had to rewrite, that whole chapter, but it all worked out. But that, I did go back and actually try to make all of those details right with some of the... What's that? There you go. There you go. With some of the scenes that are set here in Washington, I went and, there's scenes set in the West Wing, and I organized to get a tour so I could actually see, would you have to turn right or left to go down the stairs? With some of the nuclear weapon stuff, I was calling my old sources and asking, okay, how small could a nuclear weapon be? And they have to be careful about this. These are guys with security clearances who are, thinking, how much can... I'm saying I'm not trying to, get you to leak NSA documents to me, although feel free while we're talking. But, I want to get this right. Is it 20 pounds, 100 pounds? What are we talking? And so I did go back and report quite a lot of the detail that's in the book. Thank you. Thank you so much.